Welcome to Global Studies and Geography Review by Mr.DePalma. For this section, you'll need notes, review books, and note cards. We won't have a lot of definitions, but just overall themes. The rise of civilization. So I put a map of the old world river civilization cultures for you. The Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Indian, and the Yellow River cultures are all what we refer to as our original river civilizations. And they had a couple things in common. They had cities, central governments, traditional economy, organized religions, social classes, art and architecture, public works, systems of writing, and specialized jobs. We're just going to look at these themes real quickly. Cities emerged as farmers cultivated land along river valleys and produced a surplus of food. We looked in our last video about when people had more food, population is certainly going to grow. So increased population meant that more people set into one area, therefore people begin to live in an area, which ultimately leads to centralized government. So centralized government can be a council of elders to a more larger system, as we will look at in upcoming lessons, but it could be headmen or council of elders. Government develops to make sure people had enough food and make sure enough food was produced. Also, that the city was protected. Rulers also ordered that public works such as roads, bridges, and defensive walls be built, and we'll get into that in public works in a little bit. The traditional economy is an economy based on farming and grew up in these early civilizations. Skilled craftsmen and workers made pottery, cloth makers, and other goods were all produced. A lot of bartering. We're not to money economies just yet, but we do get there eventually. Organized religion. Ancient peoples were polytheistic or belief in many gods. Priests and worshippers tried to gain favor to these gods through complex rituals. They hoped that the gods would ensure plentiful crops, protect their cities. Sometimes religion was absolutely influenced by where they lived. For instance, in Mesopotamia, their religion had kind of a brutal atmosphere based on nature. Sort of interesting. Another thing, job specialization. People began to specialize in certain skills. No one person could master all the things that people had to do in a society, so skills got divided up in order to provide for him or herself. People became ranked in classes according to their jobs. Priests and nobles are usually at the top, and warriors and merchants with peasant farmers and slaves would be at the bottom. Those other classes would fall somewhere in the middle. Think of a triangle as it works its way down. Art and architecture is also very important. These things emerge from civilizations, and they're really something that they're renowned for. For instance, the pyramids in Egypt or the ziggurats in Mesopotamia. It's all important to them, or wall paintings in different places. It's important because it shows the cultural development and also what was of a large amount of meaning for these people. And finally, one of the most important things, system of writing. Writing may have first developed in temples, where the types of records were kept. Early writing was picture writing, pictographs, or considered simple drawings. Even cave paintings are considered writing. But over time, writing becomes more symbolic and more complex. One of the earliest river civilizations that we need to look at is the Egyptians. This civilization developed around 5,000 years ago. Since most of Egypt is desert, the Nile River, that big green thing that you see working down, was very, very important because it was irrigation of crops. At the head of that triangle-shaped area, that's the delta. And this served as a highway, but also served as a lifeblood for culture, and a large part of their religion revolved around this river as well. The Egyptians were polytheistic. They had many different gods. Their chief god was Amun-Re, the sun god. Osiris was the god of the Nile, very important to these people. Osiris controlled the annual flood, which made the land fertile. The Egyptians also believed that a host of other gods who all served in specific functions within their society. And the cornerstone of the religious faith is a belief in the afterlife after death. Egyptians prepared their dead for the afterlife through a preservation process called mummification, and it was all in order to pass the dead into the next life. So at the top of our society, we have the ruler called the pharaoh. The Egyptians believed that the pharaoh was both god and king. In fact, when the pharaoh dies, he's buried with all of his possessions in the pyramids. The pyramids took many years to build and required a lot of planning and organization. When the mummies of the pharaohs were buried in the pyramids, they were surrounded by their possessions to ready to be used in the afterlife. After the death of a pharaoh, they usually passed to another member of the family. These ruling families were called dynasties. So a big contribution that the Egyptians made, of course, was hieroglyphics, or their writing, or pictograph writing. And this was solved when the Rosetta Stone was found. And not much was known about this culture until the Rosetta Stone was found, where they could cross-reference other languages with hieroglyphics in order to get the idea of what was being said. So again, an idea of a lot of cultures that we might not know about a lot today is because we don't have anything to cross-reference with them. So if those things are discovered, new answers come out all the time. Social structure in Egyptian society was divided into classes. The pharaoh held the highest position in society, next were the priests who served the gods and goddesses, and third were the nobles. They fought the pharaoh's wars, followed by craftspeople, merchants, and near the bottom, of course, were your peasant farmers, and beneath them were the slaves, a lot of the people that actually undertook those large building projects. Women in this society had higher status than any other ancient civilization. Women could own property, enter into business deals, and obtain divorce, something that we'll see disappear as later civilizations emerge. Some contributions that the Egyptians made: they had advances in science and art and in math. The process of mummification helped a lot of people learn about the human body, anatomy, and physiology. And they also diagnosed a lot of illnesses and performed surgeries. Egyptians developed a calendar very similar to the one we use today. They also created a system of picture writing, as we talked about, the hieroglyphics. And the Egyptian templates and monuments and these pyramids survived for thousands of years because they were very well made, but also it gave us a look into their civilization and society, and something that we should never take for granted, that other civilizations we might not have as much information, but again, it could be out there, so keep that in mind. The Mesopotamians, to the north and the east of Egypt, was the Fertile Crescent. This crescent-shaped region produced good farmland and was right between the Tigris and Euphrates River. The land between two rivers, or Mesopotamia, as it's known as, had a lack of natural barriers, and a lot of frequent migrations and invasions made the diversity of the Mesopotamian region very, very great. With those lack of natural barriers, it also created a lot of flood zones, so religion was often negative in the aspect of Sumerian religion. Consider that they gave their gods a lot of human attributes, that they weren't necessarily gods. They were more like humans with extended lives, like 5,000 years, and they were very grumpy. And they were also very, very petty, and it was kind of interesting looking at their society. A lot of it was based off of not only weather, but flooding and land that would be lost, and houses and lives that could be lost as well. The first civilization in Mesopotamia was Sumer, as we just mentioned before. They developed along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers about 5,000 years ago, so close to our Egyptians. The Sumerians were polytheistic, also like the Egyptians, and they built their cities around pyramid-like structures called ziggurats. The ziggurats had steps that people could climb to reach the shrines of that particular city of chief god or goddesses. Remember, these gods and goddesses have very human attributes, so it's interesting to see how religion can mold in with certain ideas of nature, similar to what animism was earlier on that we looked at last video. Some technological aspects that the Sumerians developed was irrigation systems, dikes and canals to provide protection from floods, and water for crops. They grew wealthy from trade from places as far away as Egypt and India. Among their contributions Sumerians made to the world were the first wheeled vehicles and the metal plow, and also a 12-month calendar where the cycle based on the cycles of the moon. They also had a number system based on 60, which is the basis for our clocks, minutes and seconds. They also developed cuneiform, which is wedge-shaped writing formed by pressing a pen-like instrument into clay. The Babylonians established an empire that grew out of states or territories governed by one ruler. Babylon's most powerful ruler was Hammurabi. with the Code of Hammurabi. And he's best known for this law code in which a major collection of laws in their history was put together. One note of this, the laws did favor higher classes over lower ones. They established standards of justice for all classes, though. Punishment was harsh, stressing the idea of an eye for an eye or a tooth for a tooth. That is only of the same class, though. That's an important distinction. If a rich man blinds a poorer man or someone of a lower class than them, then there's a sum of money paid out. It's not equal. Our next civilization is our Indus River Valley civilization, and they're very reliant on the monsoon. The monsoon to this day is a hugely effective thing that affects India for farmers and for the government. It's one of those things that absolutely influences their history altogether. If it's early, if it's late, if it's destructive, it is still an influential thing to this day, even with technology in play. So the monsoons are actually winds that bring rain every summer. India depends on these monsoons to grow their crops. When there's not enough rain, people could not grow crops. When there was too much, rivers caused deadly floods. It was a delicate balance for these people. Some Indus Valley cities, about 2500 BC, at about the time when the pyramids were rising in Egypt, the first Indian civilizations arose in the Indian River Valley. Archaeologists have found remains of impressive cities, but little is known about their civilizations that produced them. It is unclear how the civilization covered a large area and the cities were planned. The blocks and bricks are uniform, and a lot of the artwork that we found is very impressive. So it's quite unique, and I recommend you look some other stuff up about it if you're interested at all. The two main cities of this civilization were the Harappa and the Mohenjo-daro. Roads that were laid out on grid patterns led to each one of these cities, and they were dominated by structures on a hill. Some think they are fortresses or temples or granaries. People are not really sure. There's not much known about these civilizations. There's a lot of junk out there about the civilization and what happened to them, but really people are not sure. Some impressive things, though, the outlining villages' houses were made of brick that was very uniform. They all had plumbing with baths and chutes that had sewers. The Indus Valley people were farmers. They were the first to grow cotton and weave into cloth. Merchants traveled as far as the cities of Sumer. One of the aspects of the decline of the Indian River civilization around 1750 BC, it begins to decline for unknown reasons. But in about 1500 BC, nomadic warriors called the Aryans from an area around Asia Minor conquered the Indus Valley. A similar group also moved into Egypt, the Hittites, from that similar area right around Asia Minor, present-day Turkey. Finally, our last of our river civilizations is the Chinese civilization. The Chinese river civilization grew up around the Honghe, or the Yellow River, and the Yangtze. Geographically, mountains and deserts and jungles and an ocean isolated the Chinese culture more than it did any other early river civilization. So the Chinese developed this idea that their culture was the center of the earth, and they called it the Middle Kingdom. Although China covers a huge area, until recent times most people lived only along the east coast or in the river valleys. Despite its isolation, though, China traded with other cultures. Chinese goods reached the Middle East and even beyond. The Silk Road, for instance. In about 1650 BC, a Chinese people called the Shang gained control of parts of northern China. Although there was a king in Shang China, clans or groups of families controlled most of the land. In this way, China was more similar to the small kingdoms of the Aryan India or the Sumer city-states, rather than a centralized government such as Egypt. So the Shang set up the first dynasties or ruling families in China. Social structure in Shang society resembled that of other ancient cultures. A class of noble warriors owned the land. Merchants and craftspeople earned a living in cities. Most people, however, were peasants, and they lived in farming villages or small villages, again, around the river. The Shang people were also polytheistic. They had many gods and they had natural spirits. The Chinese looked to their dead ancestors to intercede with the gods to help the living, offering sacrifices of food and other objects. The ancient Chinese also believed that the universe held a very delicate balance between two forces, the yin and the yang. When these forces were in balance, peace and prosperity would result. This is an oversimplification of yin and yang, but consider the idea of Luke Skywalker and Darth Vader. In Luke Skywalker, there's a little bit of Darth Vader, a little evil, and in Darth Vader, there's a little bit of Luke Skywalker, a little bit of good. Again, it's an oversimplification of the idea of yin and yang, but there's a balance, and those two things are always equal. Some contributions of the Chinese, without a doubt, writing. Around 4,000 years ago, writing began to emerge in China. The Chinese used a system of writing that included both pictographs, or drawing of objects, and ideographs, of drawing of thoughts and ideas. Because the Chinese writing system consisted of tens of thousands of characters, only the upper class had the time to learn to read and to write. China also had its fair share of other contributions that we'll go into later, for instance, clocks or certain vaccines for diseases or even gunpowder. Those will be covered later on, but the Chinese writing is among one of the chief contributions for today. Demographics and patterns of migration. Demography is the study of human populations. Demographic patterns or changes in populations over time are often influenced by geographic features such as rivers. Ancient civilizations in Egypt, Mesopotamia, and India all had fertile river valleys, so it brought people to that area, probably people of different ethnic groups or different backgrounds. Rivers provided water for drinking and irrigation, but rivers served as highways and for transportation of people and goods and ideas. And again, cultural diffusion, the global studies word, is chief here. A term that you're definitely going to come across is the Bantu migrations. As populations grew, and this is in Africa, as you can see from the map that we put up, as populations grew, some groups began to migrate in search of new lands. The Bantu migrations are an example of this movement. The Bantu peoples originally lived in West Africa, as you can again see by the map, but then as the Sahara region began to dry out, desertification, this is still happening to this day, ironically, these skilled farmers and herders migrated south and east in search of fertile land. So between 500 BC and AD 1500, the Bantu settled, spreading their knowledge of farming and ironworking, as well as their language across the continent. And today, a third of all Africans speak a language that is in the Bantu family, or Bantu family. One of the aspects of cultural diffusion is language, art, architecture, religion, warfare, travel. All these things have an influence on the areas that they touch or settle in, and it produces something new. And that, in essence, is cultural diffusion.